Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa azwajihi wa zurriyyatihi ajmain. We are looking at Habermas' critique of Klein's conception of rationality. It basically covered this part as well, but we'll just read it again. Klein himself recognizes the danger that has to arise for a logic of argumentation when the concept of validity is replaced by that of acceptance. One might think that in this approach, now this is a quotation from Klein, one might think that in this approach we drop truth and relation to reality. So truth and relation to reality is what differentiate between mere acceptance and validity, as we saw last time. So approach we drop truth and relation to reality with which argumentation should possibly be concerned. It seems as if this way of looking at things focusing only on who gets his way. It seems like his way, acceptance way, but not on who is right. But what should indeed, but that should indeed be a serious error. So what Klein is saying that his intention is not to reduce validity to mere acceptance. And probably Habermas agrees, but he raises a similar concern, but at a different level, so to speak. So the logic of argumentation requires a conceptual framework that permits us to take into account the phenomena of the peculiarly constraint-free force of the better argument. So we had looked at what that could mean. And basically, constraint-free force of better argument is when the truth is the guiding principle in your acceptance of the claims within given situation. The unfolding of such an argument, again, it looks like a quotation from Klein, I think. The unfolding of such an argument is by no means a friendly agreement on some view or the other. What is collectively valid can in some cases be pragmatically very unpleasant for a participant. What is collectively valid? So according to Klein. But if it follows from what is valid by way of if it follows from what is valid by way of valid transitions, then it just is valid whether he wants it to be or not, because it's based on reality and truth. Reality and truth transcend our desires. One cannot very well defend oneself against thinking. Yeah. So you have to. So there's the force of better argument. So it is a force, but it's not a physical force. The force of conviction or truth or reality forcing itself on you, not as a brute fact, but as a rational constraint. Transitions from what is valid take place in us, whether or not we like them. So that seems like here's a clear distinction between mere acceptance and validity. That is Klein. So obviously Habermas's critique, as we have already seen, can't be on this level. It is on the next level. The critique is at the next level, not at this basic level. I mean, if the critique was at this basic level, it would have been hardly worth looking at, really. On the other hand, now Habermas again, relativistic consequences that is acceptance. We'll get to that in a minute. are unavoidable if what is collectively valid is conceived only as a social fact. So that's the second level of critique. So how does Klein take it as a social fact? That's Habermas's critique. Social fact that as a social fact that is without any internal relation to the rationality of reason. So it seems like at this point anyway, Habermas's critique. Let's look at this without going further because he's quoting Klein again, so it might not be his point, but let's see anyway. So Habermas give it to Klein that he had some conception of the distinction between mere acceptance and validity. So that's not the level at which Habermas critique Klein. But what he's probably saying is that despite these distinctions, he cannot avoid relativistic consequences. That is, although he has a distinction between validity and acceptance, his conception of validity itself is relativistic. That is, he doesn't have any criteria to distinguish between validity at collectivity A and validity at collectivity B, and this is at time t1 and this is at time t2, at the same issue, or whether the same participants, and so they agree collectively on something being valid, so v1, and here they agree on something v2. How are we going to distinguish or decide between these two outcomes except through the passage of time, that what we did at point t2e overcomes t1, but there's no rational criterion for this transition. On what basis at time t1 the same thing was collectively valid as v1, but at time t2 the same thing, what we now consider collectively valid is v2, but we don't have any rational transcendent sort of criterion to distinguish between v1 and v2 except the passage of time. So I think that's what he means by relativistic consequences. So that's his critique of Klein, as far as we understand it up to this point. But it might be, we might need to amend our understanding or even totally abandon it as we read along. Okay, let's just reread it in the light of what we just said. On the other hand, relativistic consequences are unavoidable if what is collectively valid is conceived only as a social fact. And how that would be the case, that is without any internal relation to the rationality of reason. And by that we understood that there's no internal relationship between the rationality of reason at v1 and v2 except the passage of time. Although within A and B we have a criterion to evaluate reasons, but across those they become mere social facts. This is a social fact, we accept it here and it's here. And the only way to choose between them is that since this is after the first one, then what comes what comes last has a priority. That's what we agreed upon. Okay, so it appears to be arbitrary with whether this or that comes to be valid for an individual or a collective. Some believe this, others that, and what wins out depends on contingencies, on greater rhetorical skills or physical force. Overall contingency of reason. This leads to consequences, that's Klein, this lead to consequences that are scarcely satisfying. So he realized that. One would then have to accept the fact that for one individual, love your neighbor as yourself is valid, while for another, it is slay your neighbor if he gives you trouble. It would also be difficult to see why then one continued to pursue research or strove to gain knowledge at all. Some hold that the earth is a disk, others that it is sphere, or that it is Turkey. The first collective, is the larger, the third is the smaller, the second is the most aggressive. One cannot accord a greater right to any of them, although the second view is undoubtedly correct. What is the second view? So Klein is obviously not accepting any sort of straightforward relativism. So what's Habermas' problem with him? The dilemma. So he has some in Habermas's eyes now consists in the fact that Klein does not want to take relativistic consequences into the bargain, but yet does not want to maintain the external perspective of the observer. Yeah. So we looked at this. So one way of understanding this, as we understood it, is this. So Habermas claims that Klein's dilemma is that he doesn't want to be a relativist. But according to Habermas, we can avoid relativism only we adopt or we allow external perspective of an observer. And for Habermas, this is essential for evaluating the rationality of reasons we are giving within the debate. But this external perspective of a theorist or external observer, this external perspective, observer has somehow the external observer as well as he is able to sort of adopt an internal perspective as well, or how reasons or space of reason, to use the jargon, would open up to him. So in that sense, external perspective for Habermas is not a traditional transcendental or transcendent perspective, because Habermas accepts that basic point with Klein that you have to adopt the internal perspective in order to open up the space of reason. But somehow, as we said several times, Habermas wants his cake to have his cake and eat it as well, in the sense that he wants this external perspective to be unlike the traditional external perspective, in the sense that this external observer would have the ability to adopt internal perspective as well. So in that sense, it is not truly a transcendental perspective. And since Klein doesn't allow this possibility, then Klein cannot avoid the relativistic consequences in the sense in which we described previously. That's Habermas's